Hi guys, welcome back to another video. Um, so it's Alberta Premium tonight. Uh, Canadian whiskey, aka rye. It's in our blood. Canadians have to drink it, and Canadians like it the best. Just like Scotch and Irish have to drink their stuff. Americans have to drink their bourbon. Uh, Tequila down south. Blah blah. It's in the blood because it's in the soil. Anyway, let's do something significant. Let's do something important tonight. Uh, you know me, I've got a PhD in theology. I've dedicated my entire adult life to the study of God, particularly in the Christian and Catholic perspective. But I've read widely. I started in philosophy, I started in history, and I don't consider myself a dogmatic person, and even in my most dogmatic days, I was, I hope, always a philosopher. Anyway, and I know that the two things don't go hand in hand very easily, but I always tried to hold them together. Okay, so let's talk about it. Does God exist? I'm going to talk to you about my own thoughts and feelings and reflections of the last 30, 25 years of my life and where I sit now. Um, the problem of God. God is a problem. God is a problem because it's not like other questions where you don't have to answer them. Do you like the Rams or do you like the Lions? Doesn't matter. Maybe you don't even like NFL. Doesn't matter. Do you prefer Coke or Pepsi? Who cares? Even, are you liberal or are you conservative? Ultimately, doesn't matter. It's all relative. The question of God, I've told you last time that um, it's not a question that can stand on its own because people mean different things by the same word. Univocal versus equivocal. Look up those words, my friends, if you don't know what they mean. God is something that every human being has to deal with. I love Benedict the 16th, Benedict 16th's phrase. He was Cardinal Ratzinger, Joseph Ratzinger. In one of his books, he wrote that humanity began the instant he said, "Is there a God?" I'm not quoting him, I'm paraphrasing him. The point is, the question of God's existence is at the heart of what it is to be human. And in all the funny questions and observations that arose, for instance, in the Age of Enlightenment, when God became a topic of debate, and I've quoted Voltaire before, and I have a decent degree of acquaintance with the thought of Immanuel Kant and his rationalist approach to theology, ethics, and all that. God is something that we don't know how to do without. Now, this is a basic problem of mankind in the sense that man exists at a level beyond mere sense perception. So if we contrast our lives with those of animals, for instance, or even computers, we have a consciousness of our sensory life. So not only do we sense things, we ask questions about the things we sense. A lion doesn't ask himself, Is it good to eat gazelles? Is it more virtuous to eat gazelles when the sun is shining or when it's raining? He doesn't ask questions like that. He does what comes naturally to him. He follows his appetites. On the other hand, man questions himself about everything he does. I mean, he should question himself. But the problem is, answers aren't as easy as questions. In fact, I admire the man who asks questions. I'm a question guy. I feel sorry for those who don't ask questions, who just take everything at face value. But there's a problem. The more questions he asks, the more quandaries, conundrums, dissatisfactions he encounters. God is a funny thing. Let's think about God then from the perspective of people. Okay, so my father was a scientist, quite admirable man, and he once said to me that the old idea of the four elements was that's a pretty good idea, actually. And phenomenologically, it is a good idea because there's hot things, there's wet things, there's gaseous things, and there's solid things, right? Heavy things, light things, wet things, dry things, hot things, cold things. The four elements aren't stupid. And the old ideas of the planets mean wanderers because the planets wandered. They moved their position relative to the, what do they call it? The uh, immovable, immobile, the heavens that don't move, which means the stars, the constellations that never change their shapes. The planets change their positions, whereas the constellations always move together. The planets wander. Okay. So when Plato or Ptolemy or whomever before Galileo looked at the sky, they looked at it really, they had a lot of keen observation, a lot of real genius in their heads. But we can look at them today and say, gosh, they were wrong. Of course, if they had the technology, the telescopes and stuff available to them like we do, they'd be capable of so much more than us. Plato, Ptolemy, all these people, their genius was just beyond what we're capable of. And we take for granted the technology that they could not even imagine. But anyway, is the world composed of earth, air, fire, and water? Sure, it is. We like to talk about the elements. We have what? How many do we have? 115, 120 of them. I've actually heard recently that it's possible that there might be a lot more than those. That there's an object in the solar system so dense that it would have to be made of elements, perhaps that are up in the 160s in terms of their atomic weight or atomic number. Sorry. Anyway, we think we know a lot, but we don't. And the question of God is not a question that has been put to the side, no matter what Bertrand Russell or any of the modern atheists, Grant, who's the guy, Dawkins, no matter what they think, the question of God has never been solved. What do I think? I'm the same way. The question of God has not been solved. I know that with Kant, you can't have ethics without God because God is the authority and he's also the ensurer of justice because we can't find justice in the world. Good men are not rewarded in this world for the goodness. The evil men often prosper. Crime does pay, but that's not sufficient to prove the existence of God. Life might be unfair. Just frankly, it might be unfair. And that doesn't prove that God has to exist. I named this video, "Do I Think God Exists?" Thought is a particular medium. Thought is not the same thing as feel. And I think neither of them are the same thing as, I don't know, what you would call a sixth sense or a consciousness or a kind of awareness. Um, do I think God exists? I think God exists. I don't want God to exist because life isn't fair. And who's ever responsible for that should be blamed. Um, but that doesn't prove God exists. That doesn't prove he doesn't exist. As Kant said, for there to be morality, for there to be ethics, God has to exist. Well, maybe there's no such thing as ethics. The Marxists would say that there isn't. It's just power, right? And the people in power get to decide what's right and wrong. Slavery is right when it's convenient to the ruling elite. And slavery is wrong when it's not convenient to the ruling elite. So, is God useful? Well, Marx also said that God was useful, right? God was useful for keeping the lower classes in their place. God is still useful in a way, even though our society operates like as if there were no God, or if there is a God, he doesn't have any everyday pertinence to our lives. So here I am, theologian who's read tons of theology, tons of philosophy, and has always thought every day of his life about the big question. And my first year of university, I took Intro to Philosophy, and one of the big sections of the course was God. And of course, one of the issues you deal with when you deal with the question of God is the argument from evil. Evil exists, and if evil exists and God doesn't do anything about it, either God is not all powerful or he's not all good. Okay, so this is what I'm reading in Leibniz's book, The Theodicy, and he's dealing with questions like this. But it's, something that, and I see Squall Dead just said, just quoted Dostoevsky, quoted Brothers Karamazov. I can accept God, but I can't accept the world that he made. That's where I've been for the last couple of years. My perspective is a little bit different because I'm not thinking about children starving in Africa. I'm thinking about my own life. And if you've never read William James, Varieties of Religious Experience, it's a good place to start for thinking about questions like this. The argument from evil never really appealed to me in my youth because I knew that evil came from free will. So people could do or not do what was possible to them. If my father was a brutal man or a child molester or a bank robber and it made my life terrible, well, that's not God making my life terrible. That's my father. That satisfied me back then. But I think you come to the point where, and I'll talk about this more in depth in the future, perhaps. I don't know if in video or in print. But to me, and if you didn't know, I wrote my doctoral thesis on the Book of Job, and specifically St. Augustine's commentary on the Book of Job. So these are questions that are just always been very important to me. I think that God has a responsibility to rational creatures, to creatures that are self-aware like man, maybe angels, I don't know. Maybe aliens out there in Alpha Centauri or Sirius or whatever. God has a special responsibility to rational creatures that he doesn't have to inanimate matter or to animal life. There is, open up your catechism and look up the subject in the index, scandal. Scandal is when somebody scandal is a sin because it undermines people's trust in goodness. Well, I would say that God undermines conscientious people's trust in goodness. So if God is the source of scandal, then isn't God the source of sin? Now I understand. I understand that I've been reading Leibniz for the last month. I understand. And Leibniz believes that this is the best of all possible worlds and that we can't judge that by our own individual experience. I understand that, but I beg to differ also. I beg to differ. I think that God owes something to somebody who gives his life to him. You might think I'm crazy, but you know what? The ancient Hebrews would agree with me. You can't read the Old Testament and tell me that these good people didn't have a claim on God. They did have a claim on God. Covenant means contract. God does stuff for you, you do stuff for God. I know that sounds awful, and it's not our idea today of any contract, like marriage, for instance. But it's true. Well, and then people will say, well, you think you have a claim on God because you're virtuous. Well, obviously you're not virtuous if you have no claim on God and God doesn't care about you. Well, so be it. But I can't accept that world. But that doesn't prove God doesn't exist. It just proves that God doesn't like me specifically. Is it possible that there is an all good and all powerful God who doesn't like me? I don't see why it's not possible. One of my favorite stories from the lives of the saints concerns St. Francis de Sales, who was a 17th century French bishop who was really concerned about the question whether he was damned or not. And in the end, he realized, you know what? I'm going to stop worrying about it, because if I'm damned, that's good, because that's the will of God. If I'm not damned, that's great too, because he knew that whatever God chose was the right thing. Leibniz, in his Theodicy, says that the specific evils that we encounter cannot be comprehended outside of the universal. So that sometimes a specific evil is required. He doesn't use that word. It is required for sake of the greater good. So in other words, St. Francis de Sales should say, like I should say, blessed be God who created a world so great, even though I'm damned, right? Uh, if you had asked me about that 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, maybe I'd agree. I don't have any use for that anymore. Do I think God exists? God is necessary based upon all my philosophical and scientific knowledge. God is necessary. Is it possible for a good person to hate God? If I'm a good person, then it is. I don't think I'm especially good. I'm not saintly. But nevertheless, I can accept that there is a God and that he doesn't care for me. And I think that makes me unusual. Thanks, guys. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I know this is a much longer video than is typical for this series, and I know I've only scratched the surface. But thanks for listening anyway. Bye, guys.